In this lecture, in which we are comparing bonds and loans, the first point we have is that both are very similar products. They have similar cash flows, and we can illustrate this as follows. In both cases, we have a party that's providing the financing. We can call this party the financier. We have a party that requires the financing. Let's call this the client. So in a standard loan, we will see the funds going from the financier to the client at the start of the facility. We see various interest payments coming back to the financier during the life of the loan, and at maturity, we will see the principal being returned to the financier. For a bond, it's very similar. We have the client here, and for reasons that I'll explain shortly, for the bond, we can call the party providing the financing. Instead of the financier, we will call this party the investor. So the funds are delivered to the client at the start of the bond. Various interest payments are made, whether they are fixed or floating, the same as a loan, and the principal is returned at the end. So we can see the cash flows are the same. In this sense, the two products are very similar. However, there are also key differences between the products, because otherwise the market would not have created these two products. So what we are going to look at today are some of the key areas of difference between the products. The best way to do this is to understand the two products from the point of view of the two parties involved, the issuer and the investor. From the issuer's point of view, loans are based on credit lines from banks. A corporate client will obtain financing in terms of loans as a bilateral loan from a bank. We have the client here who requires financing. He could simply get a bilateral loan from a bank, and he would have several banks who would have credit lines on him. So he can obtain a loan from each of them. But the banks will have a limit on this client, and that will be a hard limit. It could be £1 million, £10 million, or £100 million. But the banks have a limit as to how much they are allowed to provide for financing for this client on a bilateral basis. In the wider loan markets, sometimes we see syndicated loans or club deals, which essentially is a single transaction, but it enables several banks, bank A, B, C, D, for example, to come together and conduct a single transaction with a client, instead of each bank having to do one separately. So we see syndicated deals and club deals, but their basis is the same, in that each bank must have its own credit line on that client, and each time it provides financing to that client, that credit line is used up. And each time that financing is repaid by that client, some of that credit line is freed up again. But that credit line is finite, and that's the important point here. Here, we will look at the need for these clients to be able to access financiers or investors other than the banks, because one thing that they don't want to do in practical terms is to use up the full credit lines that all the banks have on them. Initially, it might appear practical to do so, to take advantage of all the credit they have available. But in reality, it's imprudent for a client to do so, because there may be unexpected outcomes in the future, which by definition the client will not see coming, which mean that they will need some sort of financing on an emergency basis. And this is the time when they need to have some capacity in their credit lines from their banks. So it is not in their interest to utilize these credit lines 100% all the time. They need to keep some buffer in them. So then the question arises, how do banks access new investors in terms of raising financing? Indeed, this is one of the key reasons why bonds were created. They are a slightly different product to loans in the sense that they can now bring in a new investor base. We have seen loans are generally provided by banks. When we look at bonds, we still see that banks and financial institutions are heavy investors in bonds because it's a useful product for them to have on their balance sheet. It's part of their fixed rate asset class portfolio that we have discussed before. But we now also see funds and other investors coming in to invest in the bonds as well. These can be mutual funds, pension funds, insurance funds, and so on. And then we also have individuals as well. These could be either wealthy individuals that have their own portfolio of assets, or let's call them the average person who might not have a burning desire to invest in bonds, but they may have some savings portfolio, and that portfolio, whoever it's managed by, will have some of that investment in bonds. So indirectly, individuals are investing in bonds. We can see immediately that the universe of investors for bonds is much greater than that for loans. So when clients are looking to expand their investor base to look for new sources of funding, it makes sense for them to try to target these clients who are not really attracted by the idea of providing loans to the clients, but would be very interested if they could, instead of making a loan, make an investment and receive the same risk, which is the credit risk of the client. So this is one of the key benefits of bonds from the issuer's point of view. One of the results of having to attract a new investor base is the fact that those investors would require these bonds to be packaged in a certain way, to be documented in a certain way, and to be a type of financial instrument or security. Now, all these requirements have an obligation on the issuer to go through a legal and regulatory process to issue these instruments, and that includes the legal cost of going to market. As bonds are regulated financial instruments, the issuer, depending on the country that they are based in, will need to have a certain period of time to liaise with the regulators to make sure it meets their requirement for issuing a bond. All these things taken together mean that it will take much longer for a client to go to market to issue a bond and raise financing that way compared to calling up their bank who has a credit line on them and asking them for a loan. As well as taking longer, a bond is also more expensive to launch. Part of it is regulatory work required to ensure that all the required conditions are met for the issuance of a bond, and also the work required to produce legal documents, which include a prospectus or an offering circular, which are normally quite lengthy documents and need a lot of input from a law firm, which all incurs costs. Sometimes, for a new bond issuance, we see that a client will go on a roadshow, either within their country for a domestic issue, or on an international roadshow, where they look to meet new investors to try to generate interest in their bond issuance, and that all means extra cost for the client to bear. Because of these two previous reasons that we've discussed, the longer time to market and being more expensive to launch, in order to have a more efficient product to amortize these costs, we tend to see that bonds have a longer duration than loans. This is because the cost of going to market tends to be a fixed cost. Whether the bond issuance is for £100 million or £2 billion, the cost of going to market will be similar. The same applies to launching a bond for 3 years as opposed to 10 years. It costs the same. So it is in the benefit of the issuer to have as long a period of time as possible to amortize these costs. That's why you would not really see a bond issued for 12 months, for example. The only exception would be where a liquidity bond for fiscal purposes is issued by governments, and we do see that quite often. But in the corporate space, we would not expect to see a bond issued for 12 months, or even 2 years, because this amount of time is too short to be able to absorb the extra cost of going to market. So typically, we see bonds in terms of duration being 3 years, 5 years, and 7 years, and even longer. Now, let us consider from the investor's point of view. From their point of view, one of the key benefits of a bond is liquidity. When they buy a bond, it's a financial security, it's a legal instrument, it's very often listed on an exchange, and all this provides comfort in terms of ownership for the investor, that they actually do own something which will have legal standing and security of ownership. And for the same reasons, it is widely accepted in global financial circles and investment circles. This makes it a lot easier for the investor, once they have purchased a bond, to sell the bond in the future. Now, the ease with which the investor can sell the product in the future is very important, as we saw previously, because it can help them to rebalance their portfolios, or they might have a change in their own investor sentiment. So liquidity is a very key difference between bonds and loans. Loans tend to be bilateral, and as such, if there is a secondary market for them, the participants tend to be highly specialized, and they tend to be financial institutions who can buy and sell loans between themselves. That's very different to having an open and liquid market, whereas bonds, especially if they are listed on an exchange, can be bought and sold by anybody. So these financial instruments, the bonds, often have a credit rating attached to them. The issuer goes through the process of obtaining a credit rating, and these are attached to the bond, but this is not always necessary. Sometimes the issuer will decide not to go for a credit rating, and then the investor has to do some work on their own basis to try to understand and quantify the credit risk. The reason why an issuer sometimes would not obtain a credit rating is mainly due to cost and perhaps time as well. Ratings agencies tend to charge a fee that is not cheap, so it would only make sense if the issue is for a large size, so that it can absorb the costs. In addition, it would add time in terms of going to market. So as long as the client can bear these costs, they would typically prefer to have a credit rating when they go to market. This will make it more attractive to investors. Bonds are a very huge and deep market globally. Certainly in major currencies, investors have significant access to markets in terms of locating assets that are bonds. This is one of the benefits of having such a large asset class, and this supports the liquidity of the asset as well. The fact that bonds tend to have a longer duration than loans is in many ways attractive to investors. If they find a risk that suits them and a currency that suits them, and they purchase a bond, for example, they would prefer to have a longer time to maturity, because if the opposite were the case, if the bond was already in issuance and was going to mature in 6 months, the investor is faced with the fact that in 6 months the bond will be redeemed. They will get the money back and they will have to invest in a different product. This means finding a new bond to invest in and will result in further transaction costs. So all things being equal, investors would like to have a certain amount of maturity left on the bond, which would mean that unless they change their view or rebalance their portfolios, they can hold the bond for a longer period of time until maturity. And for these reasons that we have discussed, these are the reasons that make a bond an attractive investment proposition for quite a wide investor universe. Funds, for example, would often have restrictions in the securities that they may invest in. With regards to bonds, they would need to be credit rated, so a bond fund may have an investment strategy that it invests 50% of its funds in bonds that are rated BBB or higher. That gives us some flexibility in the remaining 50%, but they may be attached to a credit rating as well. There might be a requirement that those bonds must be rated C or higher, for example. But in any case, if a bond is not credit rated, it would make it difficult for the larger funds to be able to invest in it. So now we are going to begin to think about the process that we need to consider in order to develop a Sharia compliant solution for a bond. We know the solution will be a sukuk, which we have not yet defined, and we will define when it's the appropriate time. We have only defined it so far as an Islamic version of a bond. We haven't yet provided a more technical definition yet, and we will later. So what it needs to do in order to be successful, it needs to keep the key characteristics of bonds. Because as we have seen, bonds are created for a specific reason. They provide benefits to the issuers and investors. So any sukuk that we develop to replicate this instrument must provide the same benefits for the market participants as well. By having these same benefits, it will continue to incentivize the Islamic issuers and Islamic investors and help to grow the market. And the final point is to minimize the additional complexity. Now this in itself might look like a straightforward point, but during this course we will discover that most of the work we do is based on this point. Let me illustrate this. So a typical bond, we can say, has some key characteristics. It doesn't matter what they are, but let's call them A, B, C. And they will be the kind that we have discussed. And if we develop a sukuk, it must have the same characteristics in all meaningful ways. A, B, C. If there is a characteristic D that a sukuk does not have, then potentially we have an instrument that is not exactly similar to a bond, and it might not be enough to incentivize issuers and investors, and so it might be a product that just might not work in the market. So we need to make sure that the sukuk encompasses all the key aspects of a bond. Now, some of this will be easy to replicate and some will be quite difficult to replicate. Of course, the one that will take most of our time is the idea of interest, that bonds pay interest and the sukuk therefore cannot pay interest. So what we will find that with a sukuk we will have an aim, and this could be to do with interest, it could be any other aim. Additionally, it could be to do with liquidity, it could be to do with credit rating, it could be to do with any aspect of a bond. But in this particular aim that we're considering, we may find that the most direct route is forbidden. So what we would need to find is an indirect route that is allowed or permissible. What we will find very often, depending on the route that we choose, we will add extra complexity. Now we will discuss this in due course, but any change that we make to a bond has to introduce complexity, because if it makes the product simpler, then that change would already have occurred in the market, because the bonds are a well-developed and mature market. So it is not reasonable to say that by changing one feature of a bond, we're actually making it better, because the bond market itself would have achieved that quite a long time ago. The bond market, like all large, deep and global markets, is efficient in terms of its products and their structure. So any change that we make to ensure that an aim is reached and that it's Sharia compliant will mean that we are making the product less efficient through complexity. And what we mean by less efficient, we mean that there's going to be some impact. The impact of the change that we are making could have to do with cost, or have an impact on legal documentation, have an operational impact, or on some aspect of risk, or indeed it could be more than one of these. Or in fact, it could be all four of these, or some other new areas of impact that we will come across. So our role will be, when we find a new solution to one of the aims that we're looking at, we have to understand very well the complexity and the differences that we are now introducing. We have to understand the inefficiencies that we are creating, and our aim then will be to minimize the impact on these key areas. If we develop a solution that does work from a Sharia compliant basis, and it can work on a commercial basis, and we have met the actual aim that we are intending, but the impact on cost, the documentation, is prohibitive, that means that sukuk just will not be issued by issuers or by clients in the market. Most of the thought process that we will go through over this course will be at this stage in terms of looking at the differences that we are introducing and understanding them, and trying to mitigate or fix the extra complexities that we are bringing into the transaction.